Some historians and Christian apologists have recently popularized the idea that Christianity inspired and sustains the scientific enterprise. Some recognize the influence of Christianity on science as a mere historical fact, but others take it much further. The controversial polemicist and philosopher David Wood argued in his debate with Michael Shermer that Christian theism is essential. According to Dr. Wood, atheism would never have given rise to science. Atheism is impotent.
Atheists would have been the last people to ever start a scientific revolution. Why is that? Well, anyone can do science now because we all accept the scientific hypothesis. We all believe that the universe can be understood, that we are the kinds of things that can understand it, and that it's good for us to understand it. But the pioneers of the scientific revolution already believed these things before they set out to prove them. They believed them based on their theology.
This may be a minor point in Dr. Wood's larger argument, but I think it's worth diving into. According to David, atheism is simply not the kind of worldview that would support the types of beliefs required for the origins of the scientific revolution. It's important to note that he is not claiming that atheists cannot do science or that atheists cannot justify doing science now. His point is that the three core beliefs required for the origins of science are not supported by atheism.
Now, if you were an atheist before the scientific revolution, would you have any reason to think that the universe is governed by neat little mathematical equations? Of course not. Why would you think that human beings are capable of figuring out the laws of nature? Why would you think that you could discover them? You're not made for that sort of thing. You're not made for anything. How about desirability? From an atheistic perspective, what's the point of seeking knowledge that has no practical benefit? So the three key elements of the scientific hypothesis make absolutely no sense given atheism, but all three make perfect sense from a Christian perspective.
I think the best way to refute Dr. Wood's argument would be to provide a counterexample which demonstrates that atheism can support the origins of science without the help of background beliefs sustained by religion. To be successful, we would have to show an example before the scientific revolution of an atheistic worldview supporting the three core beliefs that would, according to Dr. Wood, naturally result in the blossoming of science. But is there any example of something like that actually happening? Arguably, there is. The early Hellenistic period gave rise to a famous group of philosophers known as the Epicureans. Unfortunately, due to some historical mishaps, all but a tiny fraction of the vast literature produced by the school has been lost. However, what remains, especially through the Latin poet Lucretius, provides ample evidence for the school's central tenets. The Epicureans, often hailed as practical atheists, could be the group that counters Dr. Wood's claim. But to do so, we'll have to show that this school supports each of the core claims that Dr. Wood lays out. The first core tenet required for the origins of science is that the universe must be knowable. In his poem De Rerum Natura, Lucretius shows that the Epicureans held this belief by writing about natural laws, principles of nature which dictate the patterns of the universe without appealing to the divine. And so this darkness and terror of the mind shall not by the sun's rays, by the bright lances of daylight be scattered, but by nature and her law, whose fundamental axiom is this: nothing comes supernaturally from nothing. Fear grips all mortal men precisely because they see so many events on earth, in the sky, whose rational causes they cannot discern. So they suppose it's all the will of the gods. But once we've seen that nothing is made from nothing, we'll find our path and see straight through to what we search for. We shall know that things can come to be, and in what manner, without gods. The second core tenet required for the origins of science is that the universe must be knowable to us. That is, we must believe that we can understand the hidden rationale behind the world. Lucretius claims that we must be creatures who are capable of knowing, and that this knowledge comes through empirical sense data. And whoever thinks that knowledge can't be had can't know anything either. As he says, he knows nothing. So against this man, I'll cease to plead my case. let him stand on his head, if that's his wish. You'll find that truth's criterion first proceeds from the senses, which can never be proved false, for something more worthy of trust would have to be found, which of its own subdues the false with truth. What then should be held more worthy of trust than the senses? Or can reason arisen from false senses speak against them, arisen wholly from those senses? If they're not true, all reason must be wrong. Finally, the last core tenet is that knowledge of the universe is good. In other words, for science to get off the ground, there must be some motivation for acquiring knowledge of the universe. But here also, the Epicureans have an answer. For as little boys tremble and fear whatever's lurking in the blind dark, so we in the light of day tremble at what is no more terrible than what little boys dream in the dark, and fear will come. And so this darkness and terror of the mind shall not by the sun's rays, by the bright lances of daylight be scattered, but by nature and her laws. The Epicurean school is primarily therapeutic because it seeks to guide us towards an undisturbed life, ataraxia. According to Lucretius, this is precisely what knowledge of the universe and physics can do. It relieves us of our fears and anxieties. So here's a worldview that supports the three core tenets David Wood claims are required for the origins of science. Has he been refuted? Humiliated?
You see, proof. Yes.
There may be some viable ways to push back against this counterexample. First and foremost, Dr. Wood might point out that although the Epicureans contributed interesting philosophical material to science, especially their development of atomic theory, they failed to produce anything like the scientific revolution. Fair enough, but perhaps this is just an accident of history. Our friend David might also complain that the Epicureans were not even atheists at all, but polytheists. They certainly didn't deny the god's existence, but they did apportion their importance and influence to a relatively small sphere of reality. There is certainly a discussion to be had about whether or not the Epicureans provide an example of atheism supporting the kinds of beliefs that would give rise to science. And I think that this is probably the most fruitful and productive way of responding to David Wood's claim that atheism is too impotent to father science.